It was supposed to be just like every other Friday night. It was a bottle of red wine, a pile of cheese crackers, and me and Melissa and Claire crowded around my dining room table. My house always seemed to be the gathering spot, which I loved, because my house always felt cozy and lived in, and there were candles burning on the mantle and the faint hum of the dishwasher in the background. And it wasn't unusual for us to break out the old Ouija board. Melissa had bought it years ago from a thrift shop. The edges were worn and the lettering half faded. It became part of our ritual wine, gossip, and then spooky questions to the beyond. Mostly, it was just silly fun. The glass planchette dragging slow while we accused each other of pushing it. And we laughed about work and swapped stories about the kids. And by the time the second glass of wine was poured, Melissa dug out the battered Ouija board from its spot under my couch. Tradition, she grinned, sliding it onto the table. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. It was our ritual by now. Wine, snacks, and a little summoning of the dead, though no one ever took it seriously. The board was scratched and stained from too many spilled drinks and the letters fading, and the planchette was a cloudy glass that always squeaked against the wood. So we placed our fingertips lightly. The candlelight flickered. The night felt no different, and candles flickered against the walls, and the wine buzzed warm in my cheeks. And we laughed as Claire did her ghost voice, asking, "Is anyone here?" And the planchette, it slid slowly to yes. And we all laughed, accusing each other of pushing it. And Melissa swore she hadn't. And we went through the usual questions like, "What's your name? How old are you? How did you die?" And giggling at these nonsense answers. But the board moved faster this time, spelling words that didn't feel random, like hunger and door and mine. And that made the laughter fade a little. We kind of froze because it usually took some coaxing, someone pushing to keep the mood alive. But it kept moving, and it said hello. And we all looked at each other, and our eyes were really wide. And I had said, "Melissa, knock it off." And her voice was faint, and she swore it wasn't her. And the answers came quicker, like hungry, and then sentences saying, "Let me in, and I will give you what you desire." And that's when a draft rolled through the room. Though every window in my house was closed, one of the candles snuffed out, and the shadows grew long and sharp against the walls. And that's when Claire pulled her hand back, muttering and saying, "Okay, that's creepy." But Melissa, she was grinning, and she leaned in closer like she couldn't get enough of the board, which creeped me out. And that's when things started, happening. And the candle nearest to Melissa, it blew out on its own. A wine glass had tipped over, though no one touched it, and it was spilling red wine across the board, looking like blood. And when I went to grab paper towels, I swore the kitchen chairs were in different positions than I left them. And we should have stopped, but we didn't. And we kept playing every Friday. And every Friday, more things went missing, like my keys and jewelry, and even the picture of my family that hung by the stairs for years. And doors creaked open in the night, and I'd find muddy footprints on the kitchen tile, though no one had been outside. And it was Melissa who changed the most, though. And she looked exhausted, a little jumpy, and her eyes had dark circles like she hadn't slept for a while. And she admitted she was having nightmares of something sitting at the edge of her bed, whispering her name. And that's when the board started to grow more violent. And one night, it spelled, "Let me in," over and over, and the planchette dragging so hard it splintered the wood. And Melissa's hand shook as she kept it on the glass, and her lips moving silently, like she was answering it in her head. And then she started speaking in a voice that wasn't hers, and it was a low, guttural voice that felt like it was mocking us. And her head jerked back, and her eyes rolled, and for a moment, I swear something else looked out through her. And we scattered, and we were screaming, knocking over the wine and the candles, and the board slipped off the table on its own, clattering to the floor. And Melissa collapsed, gasping, sweat dripping down her face. And when I went over there to check on her, she looked up at me and smiled. But it wasn't Melissa's smile. And I made sure they were all okay before they left for the night to go back to their house. And after that night, we swore we wouldn't play again. But next Friday, Melissa showed up with the board, and it was tucked under her arm, and she looked eager, almost like she was jittery, like excited to do it again. And Claire and I hesitated, but Melissa begged that it was just a game, and we'll all laugh it off later. But the board had changed. It no longer felt like a game, and every question we asked, it answered with intent. Like, it was almost like it knew things we hadn't spoken aloud. Like, it knew where Claire's missing earrings had gone, and it knew the name of the boy who had bullied me in the 5th grade. And each time Melissa leaned in closer, her hand steady on the glass, her lips moving as if she were repeating words we couldn't hear. And that's when objects began vanishing from my house. The family photo by the stairs, my grandmother's cross necklace, and even a set of kitchen knives. And the doors opened on their own. And some nights I heard whispering in the dark of my name, repeating over and over again. And Melissa started looking worse. Her eyes ringed in shadows, and her skin was paler. And she said she dreamed of someone waiting at the end of her bed, promising her things like beauty and love and success, and a life without pain. And Claire tried to intervene, telling Melissa that it isn't safe and we need to stop. Melissa only smiled faintly and whispered to us, "You don't understand. It's offering me everything I ever wanted." That Friday night, there was a storm, and the rain lashed against the windows, and the candles blew out in the drafts that I could never figure out the source from. Melissa insisted we play again, but Claire refused. I don't know why, but I just gave in. Maybe curiosity. I don't know. But when we started playing, the board felt like it was alive. Like it was his own person. And the planchette darted under our fingers faster than we could keep up. And it said, "She is mine." And she said yes, and her soul is open. And Melissa's hands clamped on the planchette so hard her knuckles were turning white, and her head tilted back, and her voice, that didn't sound like her own. It sounded more deep and guttural and like it was mocking again. "I gave it permission," she hissed, "and it promised me everything. It said I'd never be alone again, that I'd be loved, that the pain would stop." And her body was convulsing. Her eyes were rolling to the back of her head, and a sound tearing from her throat did not sound human. And that's when Claire and I tried to pull her away from the board. But she was impossibly strong, and the candles, they all blew out at once, plunging us into the darkness. It was complete dark. We could barely see anything. And in the blackness, we felt it. It felt huge and heavy, like the air was pressing down on us. And then a voice whispered from everywhere, but nowhere. We couldn't track where it was coming from, and all it said was, "I lied." And Melissa, she screamed, a sound that rattled the walls, and before collapsing onto the floor. And when Melissa finally came to, she was lying on my living room floor, pale and drenched in sweat. Her breath was weak and her lips were cracked. And I had whispered "Melissa" as I was crouched down beside her. Her eyes, they fluttered open, but they looked almost glassy, and she looked confused. And as she was looking around, It felt like she didn't know where she was. So she had asked what happened. And Claire had asked her, "You don't remember?" And then Melissa frowned and she shook her head, like saying no. She just remembered pouring wine and then nothing. And Claire and I shared a look, but we didn't tell her everything. I mean, how could we? How could we explain the guttural voice, the storm, the words burned into the Ouija board, or anything else that happened? And we thought that maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was stress, but as days passed, we realized it wasn't. She survived, but she isn't the same. And sometimes when I visit, her eyes don't look like hers, and she doesn't laugh anymore, and she avoids mirrors. Says they show her things that aren't there. And once, when I walked into her kitchen, I found her hunched over the board, the planchette sliding without her hands on it. At first, it was the small things. Like Melissa, she would seem distracted, almost as if she was staring off, listening to someone we couldn't hear. And then she forgot simple things, the names of her coworkers, and where she parked her car, and even my son's birthday. But things started to get a lot darker. Like, her laugh was once very warm and jolly. It'd make you want to laugh with her too. But anymore, it sounded more hollow, almost like she was being sarcastic and mocking people. And her skin grew more ashy as her eyes sunken in, like she hadn't seen daylight in a while or slept in a while. And one night during dinner, I caught her cutting her steak and whispering under her breath, but her lips moving to words I couldn't understand. And Claire swore she saw Melissa's reflection in the window, smile a second after Melissa had stopped. We couldn't ignore it anymore, so we started looking around and on the internet, typing in things that we've been through with Melissa and what Melissa is going through, and Claire found him. And his name was David. He was a demonologist who had worked with priests and investigators. And when he walked into my house, he carried a leather bag and wore a heavy crucifix. And Melissa sat in the armchair, quiet, staring at the floor. And that's when David circled her slowly, humming under his breath. "It's attached," he said finally. "Not fully inside her yet, but it is waiting, feeding. You invited it, all of you, with that board. But she gave it permission." And that's when Melissa's head snapped up, and her eyes went black. They weren't hers. And they felt bottomless, like something else was staring through her. And that's when David said softly that she doesn't remember. And that's how it works. The bargain is hidden until it's too late. And I asked him if we could stop it. And he looked at me gravely and said, "We can try, but it won't let it go easily. It promised her something, didn't it? That's the hook. The demons, they don't give, they only take." Melissa began to laugh, low and cruel, nothing like how she usually laughs. And her body slumped, but her mouth twisted into a grin that was not human. And she whispered in this low, guttural voice that "you can try, but she's mine." And that's when the lights started to flicker. And the air was so cold you could see your own breath. And David started to open his bag and he pulled out a vial of holy water. And he started muttering a prayer. And for the first time, I realized This wasn't about saving Melissa's memory. This was about saving her soul. And David was pale after that night. He had stayed up until the early hours, chanting prayers, splashing holy water. But Melissa sat, slumped in that chair, whispering to herself in a language none of us recognized. And when the sun finally came through the curtains, she was oddly herself again, even though she was confused, exhausted, and claiming not to remember a thing. As David paced my kitchen, as Claire and I sat silent, clutching mugs of untouched coffee, he said, "This is worse than I thought. And if I confront it head on, it'll kill her before it lets go." And I asked, what do we do? And he rubbed his temple. "We have to document. Every case of possession has to be reviewed by the church. If the Vatican approves it, they'll authorize an exorcism. But I can't send them my word alone." And he leaned forward. He was lowering his voice so Melissa wouldn't hear, and he said, "We need evidence." 2 nights later, they arrived just after dusk. And it was a small paranormal research team. There was 3 of them. 2 of them were men, and we also saw a woman carrying cases of equipment, like they were moving in for war. And David introduced them only by the first names, which unsettled me a little bit. But they weren't here for publicity or a TV show. They were here to gather proof that something inside my friend wasn't human. Melissa sat on the couch as they unpacked their gear, and she watched them with that faint smile, and she'd been wearing it all week, hands folded neatly in her lap. And the investigators moved carefully, their voices low, and every light in the house was dimmed, every curtain drawn tight. The woman sprinkled salt across the thresholds and windowsills, while the others set up cameras in every corner. Infrared, thermal, night vision, digital recorders were placed on the mantle and under the table, and even tucked into the cushions of the couch where Melissa sat. And David had warned us that we need to be cautious and that to not provoke it. Don't ask questions, don't give it an opening. And that alone had sent shivers down my back. And for the first hour, nothing really happened. Melissa sat motionless, sipping water, answering politely when spoken to, and Claire and I whispered in the kitchen, trying to pretend we weren't terrified. And then one of the monitors crackled. The thermal camera aimed at the hallway, and it showed a shape, and it was something like really tall, but it was hunched, and it was moving slowly past the doorway. But the hallway itself, when we looked at it, it was empty. And then there was a cold spot. And then one of the men muttered, "Cold spot." And he tapped the screen, and that's at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. An EVP recorder hissed and then played back with a whisper, "Mine." And that's when we all froze, because Melissa's head tilted slightly, as though she heard it too. And the team moved cautiously, layering questions and Latin prayers, calling for a response. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath, and one of the cameras flickered and went black, as though something had passed directly in front of it. And then Melissa laughed. And it wasn't her laugh. It was a deeper, cruel, bubbling up from somewhere that didn't belong to her body. And the sound twisted in the air of the room. And the woman from the team whispered a prayer, crossing herself. And that's when Melissa's body jerked. Her hands clawed at the couch cushions, and her voice came out layered, 2 tones at once. "You think they can help you. You think your holy toys matter. She's already mine. The lights flickered violently, and a heavy picture frame launched from the wall and shattered across the floor. One of the cameras toppled, its screen showing static before it cut out. And then the caution, it finally turned to fear, and David barked at the team, "No more provoking. Record everything. Do not engage." And they backed off quickly, retreating behind their equipment like soldiers retreating behind shields. And I could see the fear on their faces. These weren't amateurs. They had seen things, but this was different. And Melissa's eyes, they rolled back until only the whites showed. She thrashed her limbs, bending in ways that made my stomach twist, hearing all the bones cracking, and her voice was no longer layered. It was multiplied, a chorus of shrieks and laughter, all spilling out of her at once. And every door in the house slammed shut. The Ouija board, locked away in my kitchen cabinet, banged furiously against the door. The wood was splintering like it was trying to claw its way free. And the team scrambled to keep recording, and one of them muttering, "We have enough, we have enough. This is undeniable." But David, he shook his head and his eyes grim. "Not yet. The Vatican will want more than noise and shadows. They'll want to see what it's doing to her soul." And at that, Melissa's body went still, and she looked straight at David, and her mouth curling into that awful, not Melissa smile. And in a voice that rattled the windows, she hissed, "By the time Rome listens, she will be gone." The team insisted on staying through the night, and one of them had said that activity peaks after midnight. But the way he said it made my stomach twist, like we weren't just waiting for things to happen, but we were inviting them. And they checked their equipment, speaking in clipped whispers, their faces pale but steady. And David stayed near Melissa, rosary in hand, lips moving in silent prayers. Melissa was calm now, but it felt too calm. And it was very odd because she sat cross-legged on the couch, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was watching the cameras and wires being set up like a bored child waiting for bedtime. But the air felt wrong, and it pressed down heavy on my chest, and it felt thick and cold, like the house itself was holding its breath. And 1 a.m. came around, and the first piece of equipment to go was the thermal camera in the hallway. One moment it showed the corridor empty, the next it bled static across the screen, and then went dead with a pop. The man monitoring it cursed under his breath and yanked the plug, but David stopped him. He said, "Don't touch it. It didn't fail. It was shut off." And that, out of nowhere, we heard a chuckling. From the couch, it was Melissa looking up. Maybe it didn't like being watched, she had said. And when she smiled, her teeth looked sharp in the candlelight. And by that time, it was about 2 a.m. One of the investigators set an EMF meter on the coffee table. The device immediately began shrieking, lights flashing red at the same time, and it was deep scratches appeared across the wall behind Melissa. 3 long gouges carved into the paint and wood, and it was slow enough for us to watch them form. And that's when Claire gasped and pressed against me, shaking. "Oh my God, it's here. It's really here." And the woman from the team snapped photos, her hands trembling. These weren't there before. And Melissa had tilted her head and her voice low and mocking. "Marking the house. It's mine now. All of it." And then, by 3 a.m., The hour of legends, also called the witching hour. And the room went deathly still, the candle flame shrinking to blue pinpricks. Melissa stiffened, her body rising slowly from the couch. Her hair fell back from her face, her arms limp at her sides as if invisible hands were lifting her into the air. And that's Claire screamed. Claire screamed. One of the men rushed forward instinctively, reaching to grab her ankle. But before he could touch her, he was thrown across the room, slammed into the wall so hard the drywall cracked. And David shouted, clutching his rosary, chanting louder now. Melissa's body hung in mid-air. Her eyes rolled white, her mouth open in a grin too wide for her face. From her throat came not one voice, but dozens, all layered, men, women, children, even animalistic snarls. You can't take her. She chose. She is ours. And then her body dropped, suddenly, the floor shaking with the impact. And at 3:45, the investigator who had been thrown lay groaning, blood running from his nose. The others scrambled to drag him away. But the equipment began to fail one by one. Cameras died, recorders screeched, a crucifix. One of them had hung above the doorway had fallen, and its metal was bent as if it had been melted. And I screamed. Then the air grew sharp, like needles against my skin. It felt like electricity. The hairs were coming up off my arms. And I heard it. It was a voice right in my ear, whispering my name. And I screamed, swatting at nothing. But Claire cried out at the same time, her nails digging into my arm. And the woman from the team, she had stumbled back. She was clutching her throat and gasping as red welts appeared across her neck in the shape of fingers. Something invisible was choking her. And David, he lunged, throwing holy water toward her. The welts faded, and she collapsed, sobbing. And the smell of sulfur had burned in the air. And by 4:15, we tried to regroup in the dining room, but Melissa followed, moving stiffly, her smile frozen. She sat at the table like a queen at her throne, eyes black from corner to corner. And David's voice trembled as he spoke to the team. Get every second of this. The Vatican won't deny us after tonight, but do not engage it again. It wants someone to break. And Melissa, she leaned forward, and her voice was very deep and raspy. You think Rome will save her? By the time they answer, she'll already be mine. Do you want to know what she promised me? And Melissa, she grinned wider, her teeth gleaming. She begged for love, for beauty, for someone to want her, and I said yes. And her laughter, her malicious laughter, had filled the room, rattling the glass in my cupboards. And that's when I realized she hadn't been tricked into this. She had asked for it. And by dawn, the team had collected enough evidence. Hours of footage, voices, scratches, objects moving, the levitation. They promised to send it all to Rome immediately. But the demon was right. The approval would take time. And Melissa, our Melissa, sat in the dining room, sipping coffee with shaking hands, smiling faintly, as if she had a perfectly normal night. Only her eyes betrayed her. They didn't look like hers anymore. And by dawn, Melissa was slumped in the chair, her head hanging low, and her breathing was slow and ragged. And the demon seemed tired, like the body it was wearing had drained it for the night. And that's when David motioned us now while it sleeps. Together, we carried her upstairs to the guest room. Her skin was clammy, her lips were cracked, but her faint smile never faded. Even unconscious, it felt like she was mocking us, or whatever was inside was mocking us, and it was creepy. And David directed the team like soldiers preparing for a war zone. And he said, "We fortify the room, nothing in, nothing out." The investigators worked quickly. They painted crucifixes and holy symbols across the walls and ceiling. Their hands shaking, but it was very precise. The crosses were nailed above the bed, into the corners, even carved into the wood of the door. And David pulled a coil of thick rope from his bag and poured holy water over it until it dripped onto the floor, and he whispered prayers as he tied the rope into knots, then fastened Melissa's wrists and ankles, binding her to iron rings they drilled into the wall. The smell of wet rope and incense filled the air. Every window was boarded up with wooden planks, the hammering echoing through the house. And when they were done, David sprinkled holy water over the boards and pressed his crucifix against them until steam was hissing faintly from the wood. And finally, he walked the perimeter of the room. He was sprinkling holy water in small, slow circles, chanting under his breath. And when he was finished, the air felt thicker, but it felt like it was only contained in that room, like the room itself had been turned into a cage. Claire had clutched my arm and asked David, "What if it doesn't hold?" And David's face was grave. "It will for now," he had told us. And that morning, the investigators packed the evidence, hours of footage showing Melissa levitating, speaking in voices not her own, scratches forming on the walls, objects hurling themselves across the room. They included the audio of the guttural voices, the growls, and the way Melissa recited prayers backward without ever learning Latin. And David sealed the tapes and digital drives himself. The church will see this for what it is. They'll have no choice. Melissa stirred as they carried the evidence out. Her eyes flickered open, black seeping where the white should be, and she said, "Send your tapes. Rome is slow. I am not." And we all just froze. We stood there while she was laughing, a malicious laugh, and then she slumped back into silence. A week. It took a week. That's how long it took for the Vatican to respond. 7 days of hell, literally. Melissa never stopped whispering. Even in her sleep, her voice bled through the walls, muttering the languages none of us understood. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the boards on the windows rattled violently, as if something was pounding from the inside, trying to get out. And the rope soaked in holy water had blackened, and it burned in places like acid had eaten it. And one night, Claire swore she saw Melissa's shadow moving on the wall, while Melissa herself laid motionless in bed. And David kept watch every night, pacing the hallway outside the room, crucifix in hand, and the rest of us barely slept. And when the Vatican's approval finally came through, David almost collapsed in relief. We all did. Finally. And that's when 2 days later, Father Antone arrived. He was older than I expected, silver-haired, stern, carrying a worn leather Bible and a case that looked far too small to hold the weight of what we were facing. And David introduced him to the investigators, who had stayed on, documenting every night of torment. "They'll assist," David explained. "They've seen more than enough." And the priest nodded once, then looked at me and Claire. His eyes were sharp and cold, but kind beneath it. He said, "Stay close. but do not interfere. If you falter, it will use you." And when he entered Melissa's room, she snapped awake instantly, her lips peeled back in a grin too wide for her face. "Finally," she purred in that guttural chorus of voices, "Rome sends its dog." The crucifixes on the walls rattled, the ropes strained as her body jerked, muscles pulling against them with unnatural strength. And that's when Father Antone opened his Bible and David uncapped vials of holy water, and the team switched on their cameras. Father Antone opened his Bible as David uncapped the vials of holy water, and the team switched on their cameras. And the air turned heavy, like the storm before a lightning strike. And the exorcism was about to begin. The moment Father Antone opened his Bible, Melissa's head snapped back and her mouth gaped wide in a silent scream. The lights started to flicker, and for a split second, every cross on the wall turned upside down before righting themselves again. He began with a steady voice, "Exorcizo te omnes spiritus immude," and the words seemed to ignite the air. Melissa convulsed against the ropes, her back arching so violently I heard the wall creak when the iron rings were bolted. And then came the laugh, and it wasn't Melissa's. It was that malicious laugh, and it was layered with dozens of voices at once pouring out from her mouth. "Old man," it hissed, "you think words will break me? She is mine. She has promised." And Father Antone didn't flinch. He pressed his crucifix to her forehead. Steam hissed as her skin blistered beneath the metal. Melissa shrieked so loud her ears rang. Her eyes rolled black again, and for the first time her body lifted. The rope strained, dripping with holy water, but she floated a full 2 feet above the bed. Her limbs were stiff and her head was lolling. David muttered prayers under his breath, tossing holy water that sizzled on her skin like acid. The paranormal team filmed it all, their cameras trembling in their hands. Suddenly, deep scratches tore across the walls. They were long gouges, and they were forming words in Latin, like memento mori. And one of the investigators, his name was Jeff, had stumbled back, gasping, "It's marking death." And the priest raised his voice, "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I command you, leave this servant of God." And Melissa's voice shifted, half a child's, half a growl. She invited me, she begged me, promised her soul for her wishes. You cannot take her back. And Claire was sobbing beside me. "Melissa, fight it. Please don't listen." Melissa's head snapped toward Claire, and she smiled with all of her teeth, saying, "She's gone." And the temperature plummeted again. Our breath fogged in the air. The cameras flickered, then shut off one by one. Only the priest's voice filled the room, and he pulled out a small reliquary, a shard of bone sealed in glass. "By the blood of the martyrs and the saints, you are bound." And Melissa screamed and lurched forward so strong she ripped the ropes from the wall. Her arms flailed, sending splinters flying, and she hurled herself at Father Antone, and David tackled her back down. She bit his arm so hard blood spilled across the floor. The priest pressed the reliquary to her chest and bellowed, "The power of Christ compels you." Melissa shrieked, her voice multiplying into 1,000 cries. Shadows stretched across the walls, writhing like living things. The boards over the windows rattled as though something outside wanted in. And Father Antone's voice rose louder. Shaking with force, he poured holy water directly over Melissa's face, and she screamed and she thrashed, and the bed was cracking beneath her weight. And suddenly, the air shifted, thick and oppressive, before the demon spoke through her, calm and cruel. You will fail, and when she dies, I will wear her face. I will walk this house. I will whisper to you in the dark. And the priest's eyes blazed. He raised the crucifix high, voice unshakable. Deus Dominus vobiscum. Get behind me, unclear spirit. Return to the pit prepared for you. Melissa convulsed, her body jerking so violently, I thought her bones would snap. And then, with a final guttural roar, a black vapor erupted from her mouth, swirling through the room before slamming against the board's window with a deafening crack. And the board splintered but held. The black vapor shrieked one last time before dissipating into smoke. And just like that, Melissa collapsed, and she was limp, and she was gasping, her body slick with sweat and blood. And then silence. And the priest lowered his Bible, and David knelt, checking Melissa's pulse with shaking hands. And he whispered, "She's alive," as tears were forming in his eyes. And Melissa's eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes were clear, and she whispered hoarsely, "Is it gone?" And Father Antone closed his Bible with a heavy thud and said, "For now, but she will need watching. These things, they wait." And I looked around at the ruined room, walls covered with claw marks, ropes burned and shredded, crucifixes dangling, broken. The battle was over, but I knew in my bones that the war wasn't. And Melissa had slept for nearly 2 days straight after the exorcism. Father Antone remained praying quietly in the house, while David and the investigators kept watch. The atmosphere, it had lightened a little bit, but only just. The smell of smoke and iron still clung to the walls, and none of us dared to step into the upstairs room without shivering. And when Melissa finally woke, she was pale and weak, but her eyes were clear. They were soft brown again, and they were not those black voids. And she looked at me, and her tears were spilling over her cheeks, and she whispered, "I remember pieces." And her voice cracked. The promises, the lies. I thought I was in control, but it was in me the whole time. And I held her hand, trembling, telling her it's over now, it's gone. But Father Antone shook his head gently. Gone, yes, but never forgotten. There will always be scars where it touched her. She must stay close to her faith, or it will try again. And Melissa lowered her gaze, and she nodded, and she did not argue. And over the next week, the team dismantled their equipment, packing away cameras and recorders. They gave us copies of everything, the voices, the scratches forming, the levitation. They said it was the most conclusive evidence they'd ever captured, and still, none of it seemed real when compared to what we lived through. And the Vatican's official word came through a few days later. They declared the case resolved. A demon had been expelled, its power broken. But I knew resolved, it didn't mean safe, or at least it didn't feel like it. In the upstairs room, it remained sealed. The boards, they stayed nailed over the windows. The crucifixes, they were still hanging. Though some were cracked, David insisted it stayed that way, just in case. And none of us argued. But Melissa, she still had scars, and she had moved in with her sister for a while, and she flinched at sudden noises, and she'd wake up screaming from dreams she couldn't describe. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would sit staring into space, her lips moving soundlessly. And we would have to shake her out of it. But she was still alive, and as far as we knew, free. And one night over tea at her sister's kitchen table, she had whispered to me. When it left, it didn't go quietly. She had felt it tearing at her like claws in her soul. And before it was gone, it said something. And I braced myself, and I had asked her what. And she swallowed hard, and she said, "There are others." And her hand trembled as she reached for mine. It wasn't lying. I could feel them, waiting, watching. And I squeezed her hand, forcing myself to sound steady. And I told her that we'll never touch that board again. And Melissa let out a hollow laugh. "No, but you don't need a board for them to find you." Weeks later, I passed by my old house, and the upstairs window was still boarded, crucifixes nailed like warnings, and the yard was quiet, and the house was empty. And as I walked by, I could have sworn I heard the faintest whisper from inside, not Melissa's. It was just a voice I will never forget, and it said mine.